Speaker.
Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Less than 1 month ago, on May 20th, Finance Minister Bill English read probably the most a budget which brings the most fundamental change, a step up, a step forward for New Zealand in many, many years, particularly the period from 2000 to 2008, Mr Speaker. That the changes in this budget delivers probably the biggest reform of the tax system in nearly 25 years. The budget will aim to create a fairer tax system, bringing fairness and equity back into our tax system, which will encourage savings, productive investment and keep skilled Kiwis in New Zealand and help families get ahead, Mr Speaker. The budget itself looks over about $70 billion, just under $70 billion of spending, a huge amount in anyone's terms, but what's most important is actually not the totals, it's how it's managed, if it's managed prudently, if it's prioritised, if it's transparent, and there's accountability all the way through every single line. And in fact, there has been a line-by-line review which has produced the numbers and the appropriations in the budget that we have before us and the appropriations bill which is lying on the table. It's a budget for our times. It's a budget for a much, much brighter future for New Zealand, but it also acknowledges the changes which most members in the House, including the previous government, actually acknowledged. The difference is this government is doing something about it. Those problems fundamental to our economy, Mr Speaker, are all about the imbalances between an increasing net debt or total debt in New Zealand, private sector debt, unsubstantiated, unfocused government spending, Mr Speaker, basically that out-of-control increases in state sector spending over many, many years, and a private sector which has been squeezed out by the state over the last 9 years from 2000 to 2008, Mr Speaker. There are two features of this budget, quite simply bringing fairness and equity back into our tax system, fairness and equity back into the tax system, rebalancing or switching our taxes around, moving away from consumption, or at least trying to encourage taxpayers away from consumption and into savings, Mr Speaker. And I noted in an earlier speak on the tax bill pertaining to this budget, it still does surprise me that the Greens are in fact not supporting the increase in a consumption tax when they are on record, as are many members in the House, including the previous Finance Minister, who's no longer in the House, who pointed to New Zealand's problem of being a lack of savings, a lack of financial assets and an over-emphasis on debt and debt-fuelled housing boom, Mr Speaker, and the need not to eat our equity on flat-screen TVs, etc., but by rather building up our own financial assets, or at least not increasing our debt. In the current globe, as Aaron Gilmore spoke, in the current conditions around the globe, actually the whole world is looking at every country, every sovereign set of accounts around, and this is a very timely budget because the other feature of this budget is the prudent management of the Crown's accounts. Or, as I always like to put it, actually a much more prudent, fairer and transparent management of the taxpayer's balance sheet. Because actually, at the end of the day, it's not the government's at all, it belongs to the taxpayers, because that's where the funds come from in the first instance, and we should do all that we can to guarantee them the most efficient, fair and most transparent spend of the money that's been taken off them in the first place. And if there are opportunities for the Crown to save funds or not need to take so much in tax in the first place, well, so be it. Because we trust families, we trust taxpayers to actually make the best and wisest decisions for their circumstances at their time of life, Mr Speaker, and that's what this budget starts to bring in place. It addresses changes such as the arbitrage that was out there between the top personal marginal tax rates, or PAYE, of which we've moved from 39 to 38 cents, 33 cents, Mr Speaker, the trust rate, which is at 33 cents, the corporate rate and the pie rate, which is at 30 cents. So we're starting to rebalance. We've made changes in the depreciation schedules, the way depreciation can be applied to property, to at least try and address and change some of the incentives around so that decisions and investment decisions are made on a cash flow basis, on a fair return, as opposed to some perceived or otherwise tax advantage. And there's been many discussions in this House at questions and another time about actually how many folk were able to minimise their PAYE obligations. In fact, the top 50 of the 100 top wealthiest people in New Zealand, according to the NBR's list, actually were not even on the highest marginal tax rate. So there gives a clue as how the tax system was broken and not working, Mr. Speaker, and they are, in fact, the words of the tax working group. There's a global price crisis going on, and sovereign debt in particular is actually one of the key elements which institutions around the world and other sovereigns, other countries are focusing on. The budget 2009 and then this budget in 2010, well, that is actually setting New Zealand up to do very, very well comparatively to those countries which are unfortunately suffering crises at the moment, and as my colleague just noted, some have been downgraded. Now, some out there might not think, well, these big credit rating companies out there, they don't play any significance. Who are they to affect our future? Well, like it or not, Mr. Speaker, New Zealand owes $200 billion to the rest of the world. So I, for one, would like to actually, when New Zealand does have to borrow those funds, to at least try and make them as cheap as possible, and that is what a better credit rating is all about. This budget also caps a new spending at $1.1 billion. This is unheard of after the previous administration, basically discipline on spending and spending growth, capped at $1.1 billion. Now, I recall mentioning that, capped at $1 billion. We are talking about spending, to my colleague over here on my extreme right. Now, I recall an interjector from the opposition when I was talking about this in another debate, and he didn't think we could stay in it. Well, actually, we've achieved that already in this appropriation right there. We're well within it. But surprisingly, and this is the bit where the other side can't get it, even though we're being disciplined about spending, we're refocusing. We've found $4 billion odd of spending over the last 2 years, which can be reprioritised, and that is why there are more electives in New Zealand going on than ever, particularly under the previous administration. I'd just like to touch on a couple of points that have been raised in previous speeches, and I'm very, very disappointed because I've just learnt that the Labour Party are voting against or will not be endorsing Transmission Gully, and I'm particularly saddened about that. As people are listening on radio and driving home tonight and stuck in a traffic jam somewhere going up round the coast, just note that I now understand that Labor are opposed to the Transmission Gully. Now, that's very, very sad news to me, and it's very, very sad news to people all up and down the coast. I want to pick up a point that other speaker on the other side was talking about, because their speaker spent a bit of time on the ECE. Well, just note, because this is where the discipline comes in again, about fiscal spending, prudent management. ECE about 5 years ago, I think total spend was about $435 million. It's now $1.3 billion, Mr. Speaker. So have we had 4 times as much improvement? Remember, when we're borrowing $240 million as a country per week, simply to keep the lights on, simply to keep ECE funding, Mr. Speaker. I'd also note, actually, that the $240 million, we're actually paying about 5.5% per annum for that money. About $10–11 billion a year being borrowed at a cost to the taxpayer of about 5.5%. So when we wander through the balance sheet, when we wander through the appropriations, it's a very, very fair and prudent question to ask and address. Are we getting at least that return from the spend that the government makes in various votes? Now, I'm not just talking about the social spend, put that aside. Anywhere where the government is involved in financial assets, financial investment, are we in fact getting more than 5.5%? Because if we're not, that is a direct loss to the taxpayer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll note that the opposition is continuing its spend and debt and borrow. Well, if you note on page 136 of the appropriations, which is on the table in front of us, it talks about the increase of $3 billion in interest payments this year. Over $3 billion of payment of interest and other costs relating to the Crown debt. So we should be, as an investment in now and in our children's future, doing all we can to minimise that, because for every single dollar that's borrowed and paid in interest, it's one less dollar available to do and fulfil some of the aspirations of all parties round the chamber, Mr. Speaker. If you ain't got the money, you cannot spend it, Mr. Speaker. One final point. A lot of noise has been made about GST. Nominal wage growth over this forecast period will actually increase over the inflation that's forecast in the budget, Mr Speaker, and in